Welcome back to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. If you've been with us the last number of episodes, you know that this podcast is a ministry of the Palo Alto Christian Reformed Church, where I pastor here in Palo Alto, California. I want to let you know that in September, we are launching a new ministry called Estuary. Estuary provides space where people can have deep and meaningful conversation with people that are very much unlike them. We want to provide space where people can talk about difficult topics, interesting topics, topics that are on their mind that are burdening them right now, with others who are also interested in those topics. It's an opportunity to be heard, to be listened to have a voice. And I hope that you think about joining us this September for Estuary. So today on the podcast, we have Pastor Paul Vander Klay. He is a pastor up in Sacramento, and he is really the brains behind Estuary. He started Estuary out of his YouTube channel, and now it meets all around the world. And so I wanted to have Paul on the podcast to talk about what is Estuary? Why does Estuary need to exist? And why are deep and meaningful conversations so necessary at this time in history? We're going to be addressing things like the loneliness crisis, why so many of us can see other people but still feel so alone, why we need people in our lives that we can go to and have really can have conversations where we can be vulnerable about what we really think, where you don't have to worry about being aligned on the left or on the right, but instead you can work through things, you can process with other human beings big issues in the world. So I'm excited for this episode, and I know you'll enjoy it. So sit back and relax. Here comes Paul Vander Klay. Welcome to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. Today, I have the privilege of talking to Pastor Paul Vander Klay. Paul, thanks for being on the podcast today.
Good to be here.
Really appreciate it. So Paul is going to tell us a little bit about himself, but I'll give a little bit of an introduction. He is pastor at Living Stones Christian Reformed Church in Sacramento, where he has served for over 25 years, which that in and of itself needs to be noted that pastors don't normally stay that long. So either you have a way of just not getting fired, or you're a great pastor and you've done a good job. So I'm going to go with the latter. And I love seeing that long-time pastorates. That's what I hope for as well. And then he has a small claim to fame, which is he has, I think, the most YouTube subscribers amongst any Christian Reformed pastor in the denomination.
Which I'd say that's probably true.
That's like A-list celebrity within the CRC, which I think is pretty cool. So it's nearly 30,000 subscribers. I mean, yeah, Paul, that's a great feat. And I love that. I know you well enough that was never your intention, I'm guessing, to have 30,000 subscribers. And yet here you are.
Yeah. And YouTube land, 30,000 really isn't a big number. All that subscriber number really means is 30,000 people at one point decided to like, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll watch this again or watch some more of this, and they click that. And then they also haven't at some point decided, oh, I've got too many things I'm subscribing to that I never watch, and unclicked it. So I've got over 1,000 channels I've subscribed to at some point and watch, half dozen. So
does that mean you don't get invited to the Gen Z influencer parties in LA?
I have never been invited to a Gen Z influencer party in LA. Not one.
Oh, I was hoping you were part of that, because they get in this house, they get these houses with these big pools. They have massive parties. I mean, it looks like quite the world.
I think my wife would have a fit if I told her I was doing that.
Yeah,
and I think I would feel a little out of place. Yeah. So not that.
Well, I think it's awesome that you've been able to, find different ways to minister to people, both in your church and also online. It's really cool. So why don't we start by just getting to know you a little bit more? I know a number of our listeners, my listeners, will know a bit about you, but the question I always like to ask people is, who were the people, what were the places, and what were the things that shaped you in your early years? So like
Mm.
just like 0 to 18, like where were you? What was influencing? What was going on?
So I grew up in Paterson, New Jersey. My father was a son of a Christian Reformed minister, and he grew up in the Great Plains. A lot of sort of Depression era, World War II era churches in places like Wisconsin Rapids, Hancock, Minnesota, Layton, Iowa. And then he went to Calvin College and Calvin Seminary. And when he was done with seminary, he had two calls. One was to the little churches in Barhead and Westlock in Alberta were interested in him, Northern Alberta, which would have been very different. But he was at that point engaged to my mother, who was from Whitensville, Massachusetts. And so Paterson, New Jersey was lots closer. So he was called to a little gospel chapel that was the project of some area CRC churches in Paterson, mostly to African Americans who had migrated up from the Jim Crow South into the northern industrial towns for work, to turn that little gospel chapel into a church, into a full-fledged church. And so that was my area of growing up. And so I was deeply shaped by my parents, obviously, and by that context of ministry. When obviously the civil rights movement came through, that changed the dynamics. The church was mostly African American, and then later, when let's say heroin came through, they had a rehab program that was run, and so a lot of those people would come to church, and so it was growing up in a mostly African American, pretty poor area. And, in my formative years, a lot of the people that I was surrounded by were good-hearted people that would go to a struggling little church and keep it going for the sake of the gospel and for the generosity towards people who are struggling in life, and also recovering addicts
Hmm.
who would go there and were just trying to put their lives together. And so those were those were deeply formative in me. And yeah, and I think I probably didn't realize how I was being formed because it was just happening. It was the only life I knew. But
Hmm.
later, looking back on it, it's like, wow, that was kind of an unusual childhood, at least in the landscape of the Christian Reformed Church. So that was pretty
Yeah,
cool.
that's you answered my question. My next question was like, as a kid, did you realize how unusual that was? Like, that is unique, very unique in the Christian
Yeah.
Reformed Church. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I there were a number of other places that those kinds of things were happening in the CRC.
Hmm.
In Chicago, here in Sacramento, the church that I now pastor was had some parallels to my father's church in Paterson.
Hmm.
Um, in Los Angeles, there were some little projects in the Christian Reformed Church during the Civil Rights Movement where some CRC pastors sort of wanted to see if the Christian Reformed Church and African Americans could do church together. But growing up, I remember the first time I heard that African Americans were 10% of the American population. I thought that was a bold-faced lie because most of the
Hmm.
people around me were black. And when I
You're like,
look
it's ninety
around,
percent near me.
yeah, I mean, it's I and the African Americans all seem to be, you know, packed in, and so there's lots of them. And then you go out to these suburbs where there are white people; they're all spread out. So I thought, surely there must be way more black people than white people.
Hmm.
Just as a kid is gauging things.
Yeah. And so, at what point did you feel called into ministry? I mean, you've been pastor a long time. So, what led to that?
Well, I think some psychological differentiation. I did not want to be a local church pastor because my grandfather was and my father was, and then
Hmm.
I was the only son of the family, so the people at church would call me Little Rev, and it's like, what's with that?
Pressure's on.
Pressure's on. So when I went to Calvin, I studied engineering for a while and I studied math for a while, and then I really liked history. I got into more advanced math, and it was like this wasn't coming so easy. And I was looking around at some of the today we might say they were on the spectrum, and they're just sailing through these classes. I thought, I'm in the wrong major. So history came easy to me. So then I did history. And then I really enjoyed theology, but I did not want to pastor a local church. And so um, by my by my junior year, I decided I wanted to go to seminary, but I still needed 2 years of college Greek before I could go to Calvin Seminary. So then I decided
Mm.
I'll take a fifth year at Calvin, and I got to take a class with Nick Waltersdorf, and got to do a bunch of fun, take bunch of classes that I wanted to take, and then I started dating someone who was the daughter of foreign missionaries, not CRC missionaries, but her father was Lutheran, a Lutheran missionary, and so she kind of was interested in missionary work. And so for me, it was like after seminary, I'll just go off and do missionary work someplace else. So she had done the what was it, STM program? That she had done this program with Reformed Bible College at that point, and
Mm.
had gone down to Mexico for a summer. So she was really interested in foreign missions. So we just decided to do that.
Where'd you
And
go?
when we were in the Dominican Republic,
Oh, nice. What part of Dominican were you in?
we started out on Santo Domingo. I did my
Hmm.
language study in Santo Domingo instead of Costa Rica, and then lived out in Barahona for most of our time there, which is
Okay,
a
so
little town towards
I just
the
have a
Haitian
small
border.
connection there. My sister was a missionary in Dominican Republic for a little while, and she was in Jarabacoa, if you know that area. That's kind of
That's a
missionary
nice
central
place
there.
to be. We'd vacation there.
Okay, yeah, it was. I went there after high school for a couple weeks to visit her, and it was pretty. I was like, "This is nice. I could get used to this."
Wow, missionary in Harabacoa.
Yeah,
Yeah, we'd go there on our vacations, and
that's
it
funny.
was nice. It was nice.
Yeah, yeah. So you're a missionary, and then that lasts how long?
We were there. I did my seminary internship there, and then I did 2 terms,
Okay.
and then we came back, and I still wasn't sure what I wanted to do,
Hmm.
so I kind of frogged around. I
You're
developed,
you're in your early 30s at this point, mid 30s.
yeah, early 30s.
Okay.
So then, and I had developed ironically, I developed some computer skills when I was in the Dominican Republic, because if you're going to buy a computer in the States and have it shipped in, they kill you with import duties, but
Hmm.
you could import parts for free. So I started building my own computers. So I didn't want to pay import duty.
Oh, that's cool.
And so I helped out a place in Grand Rapids called Project Rehab for a little bit when I got back. But we had at that point our third child, and it was like, I have this degree. I'm still in I can still receive a call. There was an Article 17 when you sort of ended missionary service, but you're still in your period. So I thought, maybe I'll think about pastoring a church.
Hmm.
And I had a call to a church in the Chicago area, which as a second staff position, which is a nice, thriving CRC church in Chicagoland. But then my this church here in Sacramento was struggling with some things, and a retired minister had done stated supply here, who had known my father from back in the Patterson days. And when he was at this church, he said, "Ah, the perfect guy for your church would be Stan Vander Klay." And so this church contacted my father. And my father was about 4 years from retirement then. And my mother was looking at him like, we've been paying off a condo in Massachusetts, and we're just a few hours from there, and all our kids are on the East Coast, and you want to go to California for 4 years for some little church someplace? And my father's like, well, maybe I shouldn't. But you might talk to my son. So then they contacted me, and I remember visiting this church, and the Chicago church, it was a staff position, and there was a Christian school, and it was all just sort of all put together. I came out to this church, and it was just like, on one hand, it was a little disheveled and disorganized. On the other hand, it felt very much like home, because it was a
Hmm.
lot like I'd grown up in. And
Yeah,
so I thought, oh, let's go to Sacramento, and so we
I
came out
love
here.
that. So you and your dad were ordained in the Christian Reformed Church at the same time. You're pastoring churches. Um, I don't know if anyone's made this comparison before, but you're very much like LeBron James and his son. who has just been recruited to play for the LA Lakers with his dad.
No, I didn't.
Yeah.
Oh wow. I don't know. No one has ever likened me to LeBron James in any
Hey,
way, but I'll
I,
take it.
yeah, that's a great. I mean, you guys, that's legendary speaking. So, anyways, but that's awesome. So you're in Sacramento. You've been serving there many years now, and through the course of your time, you started this YouTube channel, and you started something called Estuary, and that's what I really want to talk to you, get into a little bit today. Is um, what is Estuary? Why'd you get it started? What's it all about?
So this church is in an area of town that California cities grow like trees. They just add rings. At least that's how Sacramento has grown until they bump into, it's the Bay Area. All the rings have come together. But this church um, has had its share of hard times. I'll say it that way. But we're in on a corner, a decent corner in a fairly distressed part of town. A lot of group home, a lot of homeless, and so I was very comfortable. The first day we moved into the parsonage, and the first day I walked from the parsonage here to the church, which is about 3 blocks away or so. It's not very far. There was a woman sitting with a suitcase in the parking lot, and it's like, oh, let's see what's going to happen here. And so for all of my years here, I I was very comfortable dealing with the homeless, mentally people with mental illness, because I'd grown up with that. I mean,
Hmm.
that had been my life. We didn't have answering machines back in Patterson for a long time, and so as a kid, you'd usually pick up the phone and answer the phone, and then we'd be taking messages for my father, and my father would have all these stories, and these are the people in church. So I felt very comfortable working with homeless people and people with mental illness. And this church actually had one of the previous pastors, Paul DeVries's father, actually, huge heart for friendship ministry. And so this church had a ton of families that somewhere in their family tree they had people with on disability or significant mental illness. So the church had a huge heart.
Mm.
Um, but at the same time, you have all this theological education. I liked theology. I liked reading. I did, I had pastoral skills that I inherited my father, but I also liked ideas and thoughts and education and those kinds of things. And everybody's knocking on my door needing help, and I'm happy to do it. We're right across the street from a gas station, so of course people looking for gas. I mean, all kinds of things. But
Hmm.
very few times do people knock on the door and say, I'd like to pick your brain about something. Oh, so you're interested in my wallet, but you're not interested in my brain. And that's something that tended to happen on the mission field too.
Mm.
So I'd always been interested in ideas. I had been blogging for years. I'd been used my blog as sort of writing rough drafts for sermons. It's just I went on a um, big Tim Keller run in the mid in 2006. I had met him. We had done a thing out with Tim Keller. So I'd
Hmm.
always been interested in ideas. And in 2016, 2017, this Canadian psychologist, Jordan Peterson, comes on my radar screen. And he starts doing this biblical series. And it's like, what's that about? Because he's packing out this theater. And when I first listened to it, I thought, well, he's some evangelical that's just at University of Toronto. He's an outlier. Then I listened to what he was saying. It's like, this is not an evangelical.
Hmm.
And so I thought these were interesting ideas. And who can I talk to these ideas about? And wasn't getting a lot of traction on CRC Voices. That's a community I'd participated in for a long time. And I really couldn't find a lot of traction among my colleagues. And I had a member of my church named Freddie, who his is a long story too. But anyway, he wanted me to go down to public access TV with him on Saturday mornings to do a show, and I wasn't going to do that on my Saturday mornings. So I said, Freddie, I'm going to just take my smartphone, and I'd take him out to lunch once a month or so, just pastoral stuff.
Hmm.
And I said, I'll tell you what, I'll just take my smartphone, and we'll take a little 5-minute video. We'll call it the Freddie and Paul Show, and I'll post it on YouTube, and then you and your mom can watch it. And so we started the Freddie and Paul Show. And I was watching Jordan Peterson, and I thought I was rereading at that point Neil Postman's "Amusing Ourselves to Death," which was written about the cable TV days. I'd read that in seminary,
Hmm.
and I thought there's something going on with YouTube and Jordan Peterson. I didn't really understand YouTube at all, so I thought I'd played with YouTube a little bit before because I was playing with blogs, and I had also recognized there'd been a lot of people had said to me, Paul, you should really write a book. If you wrote a book, I'd read it. And I thought, would you? And I thought, if I wrote, lots of pastors write books, and they're usually like
Mhm.
compilations of their sermons, and then their mom reads it, and some well meaning people in the congregation buy it, but that's about it. And because I noticed that more people watched TV than read books. And so I
Hmm.
thought I'm gonna play around with video a little bit. So I did a scented post game show fairly early on. I was playing with video. And so then the Jordan Peterson thing, I thought, I'll just make a little video. 3 reasons why this pastor thinks Jordan Peterson is important. And the video was a kind of a mess. The sound wasn't right. I didn't quite know what I was doing. So I got some tips in the comments from the first one. So then I made another video, kind of a prolegomena to Jordan Peterson's biblical series. And that word prolegomena sort of caught people's attention.
Oh yeah.
And then the video took off. And then I started getting these subscribers. And it's like, what is this? I was not at all sure this was in any way a good idea. But then people would start writing me emails and they would want to talk to me. And these were always the kinds of conversations I was longing to have, but they just would they would very seldom come
Hmm.
because there's a weird dynamic often as a pastor when you have church people. Some church people really don't want to get into their business with the pastor because they're afraid stuff will get out and they'll lose status. They don't want to be a problem in a church. They want to be seen as an upstanding person. So they tend to cover up their problems. Well, these people out in internet land, they weren't playing cover up. They would just be like, these are my thoughts. What do you think? It's really interesting. Well, maybe think about this, this, or this. And then I had some people locally who were coming to me saying, we should start a meetup. I've started lots of things and nobody comes. That's my thinking. But I had enough people saying, I'll come to the first meeting. So it's like, we'll do one. So I went to meetup.com and I put a thing out, and a dozen people showed up for this Jordan Peterson meetup. And I thought,
Hmm.
huh,
And were these dozen people you had already talked to, or
they
they
were
were
total
others?
strangers for the most part.
Oh,
They were
interesting.
complete total strangers. And
And
most of them,
what year was this about?
that was January of 2018.
Okay, yeah, so not that long ago.
Nope. So then it was, huh, well, let's do it again next month and see if anybody else shows up. Well, some of those people came back a second time, but then we had about 20 people at the next one. And I thought,
Hmm.
what's with this? And so guess I got to keep doing it. It was the same with the videos. People watched the videos, and the kind of conversations that I was having with them, I thought these were always the kinds of conversations I wanted as a pastor, but very seldom had. Most of the time, I'm marrying and bearing, which is great. I'm preaching sermons, which is great. I'm leading Bible studies, which is great. We're doing joys and concerns, which is great. But and every now and then somebody will have a problem, but nobody in church wants to have a problem because then they're the kind of person in church that has problems, and nobody wants to be that. So, but here these people, they got nothing to lose. So they're just coming in and saying, "Hey, this is who I am. This is what I think. What do you think?" I thought, "Wow, this is amazing. I've been dying to have these kinds of conversations with people for a very long time." So, on the internet, I was doing conversations with people on Zoom and then posting appropriate ones, which just fed the fire. Then more and more people wanted to talk to me. So then in those first few months of 2018, the first 6 months, I was talking to 6, 8, 10 people a week online. And then people were calling, and it was like, this is unsustainable. I can't take that many people at once. So then I sort of pared down the online thing a little bit, but we kept up with the meetings, the local meetups. Now that went on for about a year and a half, and Jordan Peterson was sick and disappeared. And so he was no longer producing new content. And people would often talk about his content, but also just sort of the nature of what happened with Jordan Peterson politically. More and more, the conversation started getting repetitious and they started getting a little stale. So, a friend of mine in Southern California who had been tracking with me all along, we had met on CRC Voices, he was excited about this. And so he's like, we should play with format a little bit. We've already got the people. How can we have better conversations? And meantime, another person, a lot of people on the internet were looking at me saying, Paul is setting up to start something new. And I would keep telling people, I'm not trying to start anything new. I'm not going to start a new religion. I'm not trying to start a new church. I'm not trying to start anything. I have what I like. I have the church. I'm a pastor in a church. That's what I am. That's what I'm doing. That's all I want to do. I don't want a new thing. But so one guy particularly pushed me, and I'd always sort of had this vision of Estuary, which is in California where the water from the mountains meets this beautiful coast. And then you have tidal pools and and I would bring my kids to the beach and they would splash around in the warm water of the fresh water and the salt water and they'd look at the tidal pools at all the little crustaceans. And I thought this is what is happening in church where sort of the church provides a place where the people from the chaotic saltwater sea can meet some of the fresh water from the mountains. It's very symbolic, CRC, Peugeot, and all that stuff. And
Hmm.
let's just call it estuary. And so John Van Donk sort of had polished off what I called the protocol, which was a way to have the way that complete strangers could have a really satisfying conversation in a 2-hour time period. And so we at that and then COVID hit. So it was convenient to sort of sunset the Jordan Peterson meetup. And then as COVID was sort of releasing, we came out with Estuary. And so Estuary is sort of a counterpart to what's been happening online. But Estuary, you can have better conversations often in real life because there's not a camera rolling.
Hmm.
And also the online had a particular profile, but the in real life is much more organic. So my friend John Van Donk and I, we went to Europe because we had some Europeans who were really interested in estuary. So went to Europe and night after night in the UK, we would go to different places and hold meetings cold with people sometimes who had seen me on YouTube and so wanted to come to that, but other people who didn't know anything. And we would just have these really tremendous conversations together. And for me, pastorally, it made a huge amount of sense because these were always the kinds of conversations that I wanted to have in church, but Bible studies didn't really foster that. Now, I love doing
Hmm.
Bible studies because I love teaching the Bible, but Bible studies are kind of here's my ideas, what do you think? And a lot of people, Bible, I don't know, Paul, but with estuary, the people who came into the room together as a group would decide what to talk about. And that, the immediate concern was all of the hot button issues are going to get all of the attention. So we're going to have to talk about Trump versus Biden or Israel and Palestine or
Hmm.
abortion or and actually the way it works, the way the protocol works, people will sometimes pitch those ideas for the group to talk about, but most of the time, most of the people in the group, they don't want to talk about it because those conversations get uninteresting quickly because the two sides are pretty hard. And what the group tends to center on are conversations that tend to be a lot more personal and practical for the people in the group. Like I've now been running Estuary every week at 9 a.m. on Sundays here at Livingstone. So I have a mixture of church people and non church people. And many of the topics are relational.
Hmm.
What many of the topics are relational. They just wind up being that homelessness has been a topic that has come up fairly often. How do I measure the responsibility I have to distant relatives um, versus how about parent child relationships? How does that go? And then actually a lot of conversations about faith, and
Hmm.
it's super helpful for me because If you're doing Bible study, it's pretty easy. You can kind of go through, okay, we're going to go through the book of Romans or something like that. So that's all lit out. But pastorally, it's really nice to just sort of have an ear to what are people thinking about? What's
Hmm.
hurting them? What are they anxious about? And this has become just an awesome way to do a lot of things that the church often doesn't do well. Members of the church are getting to know each other at a deeper level. Members of the church are getting to know people who aren't members of any church and have never been near a church. They're becoming friends across the church line. And people who are not members of the church are gaining knowledge and respect for people in the church. And they're actually, over time, becoming a little curious about, so what exactly does the church do for you? And if you're to
Hmm.
sit down and ask a church person, why do you go to church? They'll give you answers, but yeah, I think usually the question of what does this church do for you is much more subtle and indirect.
Hmm.
And so what you have then in this group of people, some from church and some not from church, is really some really beautiful mutual exploration of what's most meaningful and important to them. And where that goes long term, it'll be up to the people themselves.
Hmm.
I part of the reason I did it on Sunday morning was it would make it really easy to visit the church. I've got a unique issue because of the YouTube channel. Some people come in and they want to visit, they want to meet me. So Estuary is really nice for that because then it sort of they can not only meet me, but they can get a sense for the people in the church. And so, yeah, they'll hear me preach at 11 o'clock. That's fine. But they hear me
Hmm.
talk on YouTube too. YouTube and preaching is a little closer. But the conversation, and I've noted too, it's just often in church, fellowship is some chit chat over church. Maybe if you've got a vibrant small group ministry going, but in my church, you've got a lot of people who have been here for decades and they've known each other fairly well, usually because of shared experiences over the decades, but often over usually their formative years. And then when they get to their 60s and 70s, their relationship really isn't that great. They do a little keeping up with each other, just polite chit chat after church. But when you get into an estuary meeting, there's just lots more room to explore. So that's how estuary came, and I frankly at this point wouldn't do church without it. I find it just a absolutely indispensable tool. And people are often like, well, is it bringing souls to Christ? I say, well, yeah, but it's not an evangelism program per se. It is more of a pastoral care ministry.
Yeah.
And
What
go ahead.
strikes me about it is, well, when people think about evangelism programs, especially in Christianity, in America, people who have experienced evangelism programs over the last 30 years, what is similar about all those programs is it's like the specific goal. Like the goal is we want this person to profess faith in Christ and become part of the church. And so the means to that goal can get really wonky really quick. But this strikes me as like the goal is the conversation, is
Yes.
the connection.
Yes.
So then you're building organic relationships that some people, hey, they profess Christ, other people they don't, but they're getting to know each other, and if they have a meaningful connection, then who they are will come out, so to
Yes.
speak. And I think that is, you know, all the times I've heard you speak about this, that always strikes me as such a balm to the evangelistic wound I've experienced in my life. Like, it's like, oh, this is what because this is what I want. I want to have deep relationships with people, and the people I do have deep relationships with, I don't have a problem sharing about my faith or talking about deep things because I trust them, and um, and this is what this strikes me. It's building a safe environment that can people can learn to trust each other. So, this came out of, your YouTube channel. it's interesting that it came out of that because I don't always think of YouTube as a safe place or social media as a safe place, and
Yeah,
I think everyone would agree with me that it can be a wild and dangerous place.
yeah.
So, what do you feel like people? Why do people show up? Like, what is it they're wanting from it?
I think everybody wants to know and be known and love and be loved.
Hmm.
And so the online version of this is often called this little corner of the internet. And that's not that type isn't unique to this, but people are looking for friendships. There's an enormous amount of loneliness out there. And i- interestingly enough, a lot of other, and this is sort of connected to the Jordan Peterson phenomenon that happened. Universities used to sort of be a wide open place where you could sort of, put out ideas.
Hmm.
I mean, that's what a university should be. And university, political spaces, they've gotten increasingly closed. Now, a lot of churches have had a reputation for being very closed, but in some ways, right now in our culture, churches can be particularly open spaces because sort of the political ideologies and some of the political slash moral ideologies, churches are outliers. So if churches aren't going to be spaces where people have the freedom to explore things, well, where are those spaces going to be? People
Hmm.
need space to process. And again, in a Bible study, most people just don't want to say something stupid. They don't want to look stupid. So they don't process. And in churches, often people they don't want to look heretical or they don't want to lose status with the other people in the church. And so
Hmm.
I always pitched Estuary as church adjacent. This isn't church. Nobody's going to tell you what to believe. Nobody's going to tell you how to live. Obviously, there's going to be some behavioral expectations, but we really haven't had any trouble with behavioral expectations in the group because most people who are wanting to do something, they're going to lose patience with it because see the sneaky thing about Estuary is it's a lot of listening,
Hmm.
and a lot of people who can't handle much listening, they won't tolerate the group and they'll lose interest and they'll leave. But
Hmm.
others who have the capacity to listen and to connect, they'll find a space there where they can do exactly that.
Yeah, that idea that of both having an opportunity to speak but also to listen well is um, really fosters deep and meaningful processing because you need to listen well in order to be able to process other ideas. But you also have to have space to think or talk in order to talk it out. Um, and your point about loneliness, I think, is a really, really important point. I mean, there's been a lot written about loneliness over the last few years. Still remember when David Brooks' cover article for, I think it was for the Atlantic, came out. I think it was like 2020 or 2019, where that the title of the article was "The Nuclear Family Has Failed" or "The Nuclear Family is Broken," and it was an article all about the deep brokenness in our world where people aren't connected with one another, not with their nuclear family and not with many other people, and how we have to find spaces that are kind of like a third space for people to connect. Because, I think about my friends in the community that I live in here in Palo Alto, and we connect with each other. We see each other on a regular basis. We're dropping our kids off at school. We're seeing each other's at the birthday parties for the kids and everything like that. But the struggle, the difficulty thing that I find is that it's hard to get past talking about what your kid is doing for summer camp. It's hard to get past talking about why work sucks or is awesome. And you it's hard to get to, like, how do we have these meaningful conversations about topics that matter and are really important to us, um, without it being like you said earlier, like, oh, what do you think about Israel and Hamas? I mean, it's such a massive topic that you're like, well, I think there's a
Who
lot.
here in the room knows really anything about that
Yeah,
besides what they've read by some politically motivated media? I mean,
right. Exactly. And then you're left. And I went to an estuary, and one of the things that came up, it was shortly after October 7th. And obviously that was on all of our minds. So a few of us did bring it up as a topic to talk about. But it was nice because we had a guy from Israel there. And we were on Zoom for this. And so he was really in Israel. And he kind of helped us see that maybe this wasn't the topic we needed to be talking about. Um, and that was awesome because then we had a whole nother conversation about something else. And I remember I was just blown away that we were able to bring up a really hot topic and then hear from someone who had actually had experience in it. And then we were able to change directions. So I think there is a power to this process of estuary. Um, so what are your hopes for estuary moving forward? Are you guys hoping to see more of these pop up, or do you have more structures in place, anything like that, or?
so we have sort of the estuary training program, LSNET, that John Vidonk runs, and those basically the training is just practicing having a conversation. Um, what some of the areas where we have some groups that sort of coalesce and get strong, they they then often decide to host a bigger event,
Hmm.
and that then fuels the movement. So, and that's often leveraged on the YouTube stuff. I mean, I'll come in and some other YouTube celebrities will come in, but then we try to incorporate this process. For example, we did one in Chino, California, in John Vendonk's church, and the first thing, I think this was John's idea. I thought it was a great one. When you immediately got to the event, the first thing you did was get into an estuary group
Hmm.
before you talk to speakers or anything like that. Because often what happens in an event like that is, oh, I saw Paul Vander Klay or Jonathan Peugeot or John Vervaeke on YouTube. I want to go listen to them speak. Then you walk into a big auditorium and you sit down. Maybe if you're lucky, you came with a friend, but you're also really curious about meeting other people who have sort of been a part of this whole thing too. So what happened then was it's kind of like college orientation. When you get to college, usually then they put you in groups of people. Why? Because you might not know a soul on that college campus, but at least if you're in a little group of people in orientation, well, now you've at least got to start on potentially some friends. And so what happened was is that they started out people in estuary groups and got them listening, and then that helped set the stage then for the big talks that would happen. And then also you had process time. So and so says such and such, and now, well, what did I hear? What was important? What was, and then, hey, you've got a place to do it, and you're building relationships. So it's all about relationships, and so we'd like to just see. I'd like to see more churches do this because I think it is potentially a tremendously valuable tool that can both benefit the church in terms of its own health and the health of its fellowship, and give the church some relationships outside of itself that can also keep the church healthy. Because the truth is, churches, if a there are lakes. So I used estuary. That's things on one side of the state of California. You can look at something like Mono Lake on the other side of the state of California. You have all of these streams that feed Mono Lake, and it doesn't go anywhere. And it's a salty lake, and it's a cool lake. Don't get me wrong. I love visiting Mono Lake, but what you want is not a lot of things can live in Mono Lake. A few things do, but not a lot. So to me, I think estuary has the potential to keep the church healthy and also to give the church potentially the kind of outreach edge that a lot of churches are really struggling to have.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, because a lot of churches, it's like, how is the show we put out on Sunday morning? Is it great music? Is it great preaching? Is the childcare good? I mean, that's kind of the standard church shtick, which is
Hmm.
fine. It's a completely attractional. But with an estuary, you're actually continuing to maintain the relationships within people in the church. It gives the pastoral staff a chance to overhear stuff in a healthy way, and then also build relationships outside the church. So I think potentially it's a great tool. The most of the resistance that I've seen from churches are, some churches say, number one, this needs to have a clear evangelistic message, which triggers everything that you just talked about. And number two, and this is a very reasonable one, pastors listen to this and say, that sounds like a lot of time. Potentially it is,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
what if people actually do start coming to this, and like, it sort of serves the pastor, this social dynamic that happens in church where nobody wants to have a problem. That sort of serves the pastor, because if nobody has a problem, then the pastor doesn't have any problems to fix. But the truth is, people do have problems. They keep them covered up, and then they keep them contained until it can't be contained anymore, and then you have an explosion,
mm,
and then sometimes then you have a mess. So to me, it's like, that wouldn't be a bad thing at all to have people in the church telling you what they really think about certain things.
yeah.
Because
Well,
if they tell you what they really think, then maybe you can actually have a productive conversation instead of attempting to having to put out a fire.
yeah, because it's like any controversial topic, anything that's weighing heavy on someone, they need to have places to let that steam out. Otherwise, it's going to boil over into something ugly. But like when that steam can be let out on a regular basis in constructive ways, it's amazing how much creativity and thoughtfulness can be put into that. Um, when I was thinking about, as making that comparison between the lake and the estuary, you know, one of the things I think about in California, these little tide pools that form because of the estuary going into the meeting the ocean. When you're a parent with little kids and you walk up to that beach and you see those tide pools, you know you're going to have a good beach day. It's going to be great because those tide pools are safe. They're playful. The kids can play in them. You don't have to be so stressed that your kid's going to drown in the ocean. You're like, this is awesome. They meet other kids. It's like a playground and they really connect. Whereas on other days, when you walk up to a beach and there is no tide pools, you're like, uh-oh, this is going to be tiring. Because now I'm going to have to watch my kid like a hawk, and I'm going to have to make sure they don't go near the water, and the water's going to be too cold, and you have all these reasons it's going to be a rough day. And I think of like these estuary groups as like you're playing in the tide pool. Like you're learning how to connect with others, have real conversations so that, hey, when you go back out into the world, into the ocean of the world, you might be able to actually have some more constructive conversations with your boss at work or your colleague at work, and it's like, or your brother at Thanksgiving. Like it's like all of a sudden you see like, oh, maybe the world isn't as threatening as I thought it was. Um, so I think this is just something really special, facilitating these conversations. And like when you think about them, I know you mentioned Jordan Peterson earlier. Um, I've noticed like him, and I mean on your YouTube channel, on other YouTube channels, um, they do these kind of like long form conversations. Like this podcast, I try to keep it about 45 minutes. Um, but like some of your conversations, you guys go for hours. And it's funny, like whenever I try to listen to some of your stuff every once in a while, and I'm like, oh man, how do I have the time I don't have the time to listen to all this. So is there like, and you say the estuary has a 2 hour block. Is there something needed about that time? Like it's something important about the length?
Well, actually, that was a when we started doing it on Sunday, I had to figure out how to do it, and so
Mm,
our Sunday estuaries are an hour and a half. We start at 9. People get there at 9:10, 9:15, and we're done about 10:30. I found
mhm.
that an hour is too short. 2 hours, 2 hours can go well. You can do it in an hour and a half, but an hour is too short. And Joe Rogan is, part of this too, because of course Joe Rogan. started his podcast when, he wanted to talk to his friends,
Hmm.
and some other people wanted to watch. And that's exactly how my randos conversations happened. And often they're an hour, at least the early ones were. But it takes a little. I remember a pastor telling me, he's saying, um, I always set the clock ahead. Like, sometimes some pastors have two clocks, one that the pastor could see that was behind the chair where people would sit, and the one over here where the people could see. And the clock that the person can see, put that 10 minutes ahead, because they're not really going to say what they need to say to you until the last 10 minutes. So you need time. People need time, because it's just the way of a conversation.
Hmm.
And this sort of this little hour thing, it might be good for a worship service or a lecture,
Hmm.
but when it comes time for people, because people need to build a relationship, and they need to develop the courage, and there needs to be the trust in the relationship for them to say something meaningful. Because and that's what has really impressed me about this process, is what people will share with the group. But they won't do that until they at least have a sense that it's worth the risk to share something like that. And of
Yeah.
course, that both requires trust and builds trust. Because when other people see other people sharing and it's not violated or taken advantage of, okay, then maybe I can share too. And that's what develops relationships and intimacy and all of those important things that real ministry requires.
Hmm. Well, that's awesome. I think we'll wrap up there, Paul. I really appreciate you being on the podcast and talking a bit about Estuary. Palo Alto Christian Reformed Church is going to be starting an Estuary in September, so keep an eye out for that. I believe it'll be September 16th. It's a Monday evening at 7:30 p.m. Paul is going to be joining us, which will be fun. So he'll be here to kind of show us the ropes a bit and get some conversations going. So I really hope that if you are interested and you want to join us in person in September, make sure to put it on your calendar for September 16th. Paul, thanks again for being on the show. Really appreciate you and the work you're doing in Sacramento and globally through your online presence.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope your estuary flourishes.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Paul as much as I did. And I hope you'll think about joining us here at Palo Alto Christian Reformed Church in September for Estuary. It promises to be a space where we can have those meaningful conversations that each of us long for. In the meantime, if you like this episode and like some of our other episodes, then be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. And if you really like them, please go ahead and share those on your social media feeds. It really helps us try to build an audience who can benefit from this podcast.